There is a version of Elvis Presley most people think they know. The rhinestones, the jumpsuits, the capes. The caricature that swallowed the man sometime in the mid-1960s and never gave him back. But there is another version, documented, verified, confirmed by people who were there, of a man who could not pass someone in need without stopping. Not because cameras were watching, not because a publicist told him to. Because by every account people close to him left behind, that is who he was before the myth consumed him. This is the story of one afternoon, one teenager, one diner parking lot, and a moment that the people who witnessed it never forgot, not because it was spectacular, but because it was quiet. To understand what happened that afternoon, you have to understand what Elvis was living through at the time. By the early 1960s, the period most historians place stories of this nature, Elvis Presley had returned from his 2-year army service in Germany. He came back to a country that had changed around him. Rock and roll had been sanitized in his absence. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had steered him toward Hollywood. Film contracts, soundtrack albums, a career that made financial sense and slowly drained the urgency from his music. What the record also shows, through accounts from his Memphis Mafia, from journalists who traveled with him, from people in his orbit who spoke on the record, is that Elvis during this period was frequently restless. He would leave Graceland without announcement. He would drive, sometimes alone, sometimes with 1 or 2 of the men around him, and he would move through Memphis and its surrounding areas in ways that ordinary people with his fame almost never did. You've ever heard a story about Elvis that surprised you, that didn't fit the caricature? Drop it in the comments. You might not be the only one. He was, by most accounts, not comfortable being waited on while others went without.
That is a documented pattern, not a myth, not a press release. Multiple people around him confirmed it across decades of interviews. And that pattern is what makes the afternoon outside the diner credible, not because every detail can be locked down with documentary evidence, but because it is entirely consistent with a behavioral record that spans years. The specific account most frequently cited places Elvis in the parking lot of a small diner. The exact location varies depending on the source, and the record is honest about that uncertainty. Some accounts say Memphis, some say the outskirts, some offer no geography at all. What most accounts agree on is this. A teenager was outside. A young person, described in most retellings as visibly poor, visibly distressed, sitting alone in a way that most people walking past chose not to see. Elvis saw. And whatever he did next, and we will be honest about what is documented and what is not, but people nearby did not forget it. There are moments in public spaces that become invisible by design. A person sitting too still, eyes that don't quite meet the ground but don't rise to meet anyone either. The particular stillness of someone who has stopped expecting help. Most people have learned not to see it, not out of cruelty, but out of the specific kind of numbness that crowds produce. Elvis Presley, whatever else he was, does not appear to have developed that numbness. The accounts of what happened that afternoon, drawn from people who described witnessing it, recounted over the years in interviews and written recollections, converge on a few specific details. Elvis stopped. Not slowed, stopped. He is said to have approached the teenager directly, not with the self-conscious hesitation of someone performing generosity for an audience, but with the kind of directness that people close to Elvis described as characteristic of him when something caught his attention. What was said between them is not documented. We do not know the exact words. Anyone who tells you otherwise is filling a gap the record does not fill. What multiple accounts do describe is this. Elvis did not hand the young person something and walk away. He stayed. He spoke. The conversation, by most accounts, lasted longer than anyone watching expected. And then, and this is the detail that most accounts emphasize, Elvis apparently went further than anyone in that parking lot anticipated. The most frequently cited version of the story holds that Elvis arranged for the teenager to have something substantial, not a coin, not a handshake, something that reflected a genuine reading of what this particular person actually needed. Again, the exact nature of that gesture varies across accounts. The record is not uniform. What is consistent is the description of the manner of it, the absence of performance, the privacy of it. A crowd had gathered by that point, not a planned crowd, not a concert crowd,
but the particular kind of spontaneous human accumulation that happens when someone recognizable does something unexpected in a public space. And what people described in the accounts that have survived is not cheering, not applause. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when people witness something they weren't prepared for, something that doesn't fit the version of the story they already had in their heads. Here is what the record suggests about why it hit people that way. Elvis was, at this point, one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. He could not go to a grocery store without it becoming an event. He could not eat in a restaurant without the meal becoming a memory someone would carry for 50 years. That level of visibility changes the way people interpret your actions. Everything becomes performance when you are always being watched. And yet, by the accounts of people standing in that parking lot, what they saw did not read as performance. It read as instinct. That distinction between the performed good deed and the instinctive one is what made people go quiet. There is a version of this story that turns into a legend very quickly. The generous king descending from his throne, the common touch of the uncommon man, the hero myth that American culture has always been willing to build around its icons. Be careful of that version, not because the kindness wasn't real, the documented pattern suggests it was, but because that framing costs something. It turns a human impulse into a symbol. It takes the thing that was private and quiet and makes it into a monument. Elvis Presley, by the accounts of people who actually knew him, was not comfortable with monuments. He was comfortable, or at least familiar, with the gap between who he was in public and who he was when no one was supposed to be watching. What the broader record shows is that this afternoon was not an anomaly. Elvis gave away cars. This is documented, not metaphorically, not anecdotally, documented by the recipients, by his accountants, by the people who watched it happen. He gave away jewelry. He paid medical bills for strangers. He covered expenses for people he had just met, with the specific instruction in multiple accounts that it not be publicized. That last detail matters. When generosity happens privately, with an explicit request that it stay private, it tells you something about the motive. It doesn't fit the model of a man performing kindness for image purposes. It fits the model of a man who genuinely did not want to be comfortable while other people were not. That is not the same as saying Elvis Presley was a saint. He was not. The record on his personal life, his later years, his relationships with the people around him, that record is complicated. He was capable of profound generosity and profound selfishness, sometimes in the same week. Human beings are like that. What this afternoon outside a diner represents, if we hold it carefully, without inflating it into myth, is a specific and documented thing. A man at the peak of his cultural power, who could have walked past, chose not to. Not for the cameras were not invited. Not for the crowd arrived after. He chose not to because somewhere beneath the rhinestones and the handlers and the contracts and the mythology, there was still a person from Tupelo, Mississippi. A person who had grown up poor. A person who knew exactly what it looked like to sit outside a diner and wait for something that wasn't coming. The crowd that gathered that afternoon in that parking lot went quiet because they saw that person, the one before the fame, for just a moment. And that is the thing about Elvis Presley that the jumpsuits tend to obscure. He remembered where he came from. Not perfectly, not always, not without contradiction, but enough. That afternoon, that specific quiet moment, the teenager outside the diner got the version of Elvis that the stage rarely showed. And the people who were there never forgot it.